The night Vivienne Ashford walked into the Langham Grand Ballroom uninvited, she had $11 in her pocket and a bruise on her left wrist she had learned to hide beneath a borrowed bracelet. But we need to go back a few hours before that. Before the chandeliers. Before the gasps. Before the moment that split her life into everything that came before and everything that would come after. It started with rain. A cold, miserable October rain that had been falling on Chicago since morning and showed no intention of stopping. The kind of rain that made people walk faster, pull their collars higher, and pretend that anyone sitting on a bench without an umbrella simply did not exist. Vivienne sat on a bench outside the Langham Hotel on North Wabash Avenue. She was 34 years old. She had dark auburn hair that the rain had turned into heavy, tangled ropes against her neck. She wore a gray sweater 2 sizes too large and boots with a crack along the left sole that let the water seep in with every step. Around her wrist was a thin silver bracelet she had found in a donation bin 3 weeks earlier. It covered just enough. She was not waiting for anyone. She had nowhere specific to be. She had simply stopped walking because her feet hurt and the bench was there, and sometimes that was reason enough. Inside the Langham Grand, the wedding reception of Victoria Clement and Reese Beaumont was already underway. Victoria Clement was the kind of woman whose name appeared in society columns the way weather appeared in forecasts, regularly, predictably, and always surrounded by the suggestion that something dramatic might happen. She was beautiful in a way that required significant investment. Porcelain veneers, twice yearly trips to a dermatologist in Beverly Hills, a personal trainer who charged $400 an hour, and a stylist who selected her outfits with the seriousness of a military strategist. Reese Beaumont was her prize, not her love. Her prize. Because 7 months earlier, Reese Beaumont had been engaged to someone else, a man named Dominic Thorne. Dominic Thorne did not come from money. He built it. He had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen with a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry and a father who left before Dominic learned to ride a bicycle. By the time he was 30, he had founded Meridian Capital, a private equity firm that turned failing companies into profitable ones. By 35, he had a penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, a reputation for being ruthlessly fair, and the kind of quiet confidence that made people either deeply respect him or deeply resent him. Victoria Clement had chosen to resent him. She had been his fiancée for 14 months. During that time, she had redecorated his penthouse, hosted dinners for his investors, and practiced her future signature, Victoria Thorne, in the margins of her planner. She loved the life his money provided. She loved the weight of his money provided. She loved the weight of his name. What she did not love, it turned out, was him. When Dominic's largest deal collapsed due to a partner's fraud, and the lawsuits came, and the newspapers printed headlines that made strangers feel entitled to an opinion, Victoria removed her engagement ring and placed it on the kitchen counter beside a half-empty glass of Sancerre. "I didn't sign up for this version of you," she said. She was engaged to Reese Beaumont 6 weeks later. Reese, who had been Dominic's college roommate. Reese, who had attended Dominic's birthday dinners, borrowed his vacation home in Aspen, and once stood as his best man at a mutual friend's wedding. Reese, who had apparently been texting Victoria for months before the ring came off. Dominic did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply disappeared from public life for 5 months, rebuilt Meridian Capital from the inside out, settled every lawsuit, repaid every investor with interest, and emerged quietly richer and more powerful than he had been before the collapse. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, hand-calligraphed on cream cardstock, tucked inside a pale blue envelope lined with gold tissue paper. Dominic held it for a long time. He knew what it was. Not a genuine invitation. A trophy display. Victoria wanted him there so she could be seen choosing someone else while he watched. He decided to go. Not because he still wanted her, but because he needed to walk into that room and feel nothing. He needed to prove to himself more than anyone that she no longer had the power to make him small. That was the plan. The plan changed when he saw Vivienne. He had arrived at the Langham in a dark charcoal suit and no tie. His driver had dropped him at the main entrance, and Dominic had paused on the sidewalk to collect himself before going inside. That was when he noticed the woman on the bench. She was sitting very still with her hands folded in her lap. The rain had soaked through her sweater and her boots were dark with water. But her back was straight. Her chin was level. She was not hunched against the cold like someone defeated by it. She sat the way a person sits when they have decided that the world can take whatever it wants, but it cannot take the way they hold themselves. A hotel security guard in a black suit approached her. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. We have a private event tonight." Vivienne looked up at him. "I'm sitting on a public bench. I understand, but our guests are arriving and we need the entrance clear." "Clear of what?" she asked, and there was no hostility in her voice, only a kind of exhausted clarity. "Clear of people who look like me." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move." Dominic crossed the sidewalk before he fully understood why. "She's with me." Both the guard and Vivienne turned to look at him. The guard recognized him immediately. Dominic Thorne was the kind of man hotel staff were trained to recognize, and stepped back. Vivienne studied Dominic with an expression he could not read. It was not gratitude. It was not suspicion. It was something closer to assessment, as though she was measuring him against every other person who had ever spoken to her from a position of power. "I don't need rescuing," she said. "I know," Dominic said, "but I need a guest." She almost smiled. Almost. For what? My ex-fiancée's wedding. This time she did smile, just barely, just at the corners. "That sounds like a terrible evening." "It will be," he agreed. "Which is exactly why I'd rather not walk in alone." Vivienne looked at the hotel entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see the lobby glowing with warm light. People in evening wear crossing the marble floor. Waiters carrying champagne on silver trays. It was the kind of world that existed on the other side of glass for women like her. She looked back at Dominic. "I look like I slept outside. You look like someone this room isn't ready for." The words landed somewhere deep. She blinked, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted in her face. Not hope exactly, but the memory of what hope used to feel like. Dominic removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm from his body, and it smelled like cedar and clean cotton. Vivienne's fingers closed around the lapel instinctively, pulling it tighter. "If I go in there," she said quietly, "they will eat me alive." "They'll try," he said, "but I have a feeling you've survived worse." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she stood, squared her shoulders inside his jacket, and said, "My name is Vivienne. Dominic. Please, can I ask for a favor? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support means a lot and helps us bring you more exciting and heartfelt stories. Thank you. Now, let's continue." They walked through the lobby together. Vivienne felt the marble floor through the crack in her boot sole. Cold and impossibly smooth. The jacket covered most of her damp sweater, but nothing could hide her wet hair or her rough hands or the fact that she did not belong anywhere near this room. The ballroom doors were open. Inside, 300 guests filled round tables draped in white linen. Crystal centerpieces caught the light from 6 chandeliers. An orchestra played something soft and classical near the dance floor. Everything was designed to communicate one message: this is where important people gather. Vivienne stepped inside, and the room noticed. Not all at once. It started with the couple nearest the door, a woman in emerald satin who stopped mid-sentence to stare, and her husband whose eyes traveled from Vivienne's wet hair to her cracked boots and then quickly away, as though poverty might be contagious. Then it spread, table by table, guest by guest. The whispers moved through the ballroom like wind through dry grass. "Is that a homeless woman? Did Dominic Thorne just walk in with a street person? Oh my God, look at her shoes!" Vivienne heard all of it. Her fingers tightened on Dominic's arm. He felt the pressure and leaned close. "Head up," he said. "They're telling you who they are, not who you are." She swallowed hard, but she kept walking. At the head table, Victoria Clement saw them. She was sitting beside Reese in a Vera Wang gown that had cost more than most people's annual salary. Her hair was perfect. Her makeup was perfect. Her smile was perfect. In the moment she saw Dominic walk in with a rain-soaked woman in a borrowed jacket, every perfect thing about her seemed to sharpen into something brittle. Reese noticed too. He leaned toward Victoria and murmured, "Just ignore him." Victoria did not ignore him. Victoria never ignored anything that threatened her sense of control. Dominic led Vivienne to a table near the front. He pulled out her chair. He poured her water. He treated her as though she were the most important person in the room, and every gesture made the whispers louder. An older woman at the next table leaned over. "Dominic, darling, who is your guest?" "Her name is Vivienne," he said. "And she is the only person here tonight who didn't have to buy her way in." The woman's smile froze. Vivienne sat very still, her hands in her lap, the jacket still wrapped around her. She had not spoken since entering the ballroom. Dominic noticed. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "If this is too much, I'll walk you out myself. No questions." She looked at him. Her eyes were a deep hazel, almost amber in the chandelier light, and they held a kind of steadiness that did not match her circumstances. "I've eaten out of trash cans," she said. "I think I can handle a dinner party." Something in Dominic's chest shifted. He did not name it. He was not ready to. The reception continued. The toasts began. Reese stood and gave a speech about destiny and knowing when you have found the one, and Dominic sat through it without flinching, though Vivienne could see the muscle in his jaw working. Then Victoria's maid of honor gave a speech that included the line, "Victoria always knew she deserved the best, and she never settled for less." The room applauded. Dominic stared at his water glass. Vivienne leaned toward him. "She meant that for you. I know. Does it still hurt?" Dominic looked at her. In the warm light of the ballroom, with his jacket swallowing her small frame and her damp hair drying in loose waves, she looked less like a stranger and more like someone he had been waiting to meet without knowing it. "It used to," he said. "Less now?" "Good," she said simply, because a woman who leaves when things get hard was never yours to begin with. If you are enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support means a lot and helps us bring you more exciting and heartfelt stories. Thank you. Back to the story. 30 minutes into the reception, Victoria came to their table. She walked the way women walk when they know every eye in the room is following them. Slowly, deliberately, with the kind of confidence that looks effortless but is actually exhausting to maintain. "Dominic," she said. Her voice was honey poured over something cold. "I'm so glad you came." "Victoria," he said, standing. "Congratulations." Her eyes moved to Vivienne. They traveled from the wet hair to the oversized jacket to the cracked boots visible beneath the table. Victoria's smile remained perfectly intact, but her eyes performed a different calculation entirely. "And who is this?" "This is Vivienne." "Vivienne," Victoria repeated, tasting the name. "How did you two meet tonight?" Dominic said. Victoria laughed. It was a beautiful laugh, carefully practiced. "How spontaneous of you. I didn't realize you were in the habit of picking up strangers." Vivienne looked up at Victoria. She did not shrink. She did not look away. She met Victoria's gaze with the same quiet steadiness she had shown on the bench outside. "He didn't pick me up," Vivienne said. "He saw me. There's a difference." The laughter died on Victoria's lips. Rice appeared at her side, drink in hand. "Everything all right, babe?" "Perfect," Victoria said, but the word had lost its warmth. After they walked away, Dominic sat back down and looked at Vivienne. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said. Women like her count on women like me staying quiet. At the far end of the ballroom, near the bar, an older man had been watching the entire exchange. His name was Arthur Langford. He was 73 years old, a retired federal judge, and one of the most respected men in Chicago's legal community. He had attended the wedding as a favor to Race's father, whom he had known for decades. He had no particular interest in the ceremony, the reception, or the elaborate spectacle of wealth on display, but he had a deep interest in the woman sitting at Dominic Thorne's table. He had noticed her the moment she walked in, not because of her wet hair or her worn clothes or the whispers that followed her through the room. He noticed her because of her face. Arthur Langford set his bourbon on the bar and gripped the edge of the counter. His hands were trembling. He knew that face. He had seen it before, 22 years ago, in a courtroom, on a woman named Isabel Moreau. Isabel Moreau had been an immigration attorney in Chicago. She was brilliant, fiercely compassionate, and quietly beautiful. She had taken on cases no one else would touch, representing families who had been separated at the border, workers who had been exploited, children who had been forgotten by the system. Arthur had admired her enormously. They had served on a legal aid board together, and he had considered her one of the finest lawyers he had ever known. Isabel had a daughter, a little girl with auburn hair and hazel eyes, and a small crescent-shaped birthmark just below her left ear. In 2004, Isabel and her daughter were in a car accident on Lakeshore Drive. Isabel died at the scene. The daughter, 12 years old at the time, survived but disappeared into the foster care system. Arthur had tried to find her. He had hired investigators, contacted social workers, written letters to every agency he could think of. But the system had swallowed her whole. Files were lost. Caseworkers changed. The girl was moved from home to home until eventually the trail went cold. Arthur had never stopped wondering what happened to Isabel's daughter. He had never stopped carrying the guilt of not finding her. And now, 22 years later, he was staring at a woman who had Isabel's exact face, Isabel's exact eyes, and he needed to be closer to be certain. The same crescent-shaped birthmark below her left ear. He picked up his bourbon and crossed the ballroom. Dominic saw him approaching and stood. Judge Langford. Dominic. Arthur shook his hand, but his eyes were on Vivienne. Up close, it was undeniable. The resemblance was not a coincidence. It was inheritance. And there it was, just below her left ear, a small crescent-shaped birthmark, pale against her skin, exactly where Isabel's daughter had one. Arthur's hand tightened around his glass. His voice came out carefully, as though he was afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter something fragile. "Forgive me," he said, "but may I ask your name?" Vivienne looked at him warily. "Vivienne. Vivienne what?" Dominic stepped slightly closer to her. "Why do you ask?" Arthur did not take his eyes off her. "Please. I need to know." Something in his voice made Vivienne answer, not the authority. She had learned long ago not to trust authority, but the pain. He sounded like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "Moreau," she said. "Vivienne Moreau." The glass slipped from Arthur's hand and shattered on the marble floor. The people at the nearest tables turned to look. A waiter rushed over with a towel. But Arthur did not move. He stood perfectly still, tears filling his eyes, staring at Vivienne as though she were a ghost. "Moreau," he whispered. Dominic put his hand on Vivienne's shoulder. "Judge Langford, what is going on?" Arthur's voice broke. "Did your mother's name happen to be Isabel?" Vivienne went rigid. The color drained from her face. She had not heard anyone speak her mother's name in over a decade. She had not allowed herself to say it because saying it made the loss too real, too present, too alive. "How do you know that name?" she whispered. Arthur lowered himself into the empty chair beside her as though his legs could no longer hold him. "Because I knew her. I served with her on the Legal Aid Foundation board. She was one of the most remarkable women I have ever known." Vivienne's hands began to shake. She died when I was 12. I know, Arthur said. I was at her funeral, and I spent the next 10 years trying to find you. The ballroom noise seemed to recede. Vivienne could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and uneven. What do you mean, trying to find me? Arthur wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He was no longer trying to maintain composure. After the accident, you were placed in foster care. I petitioned the court to become your guardian. Twice. Both times I was denied because I was not a blood relative. I hired a private investigator. I contacted every foster agency in the state, but you kept being moved, and the records were incomplete, and eventually... His voice cracked. Eventually, I lost the trail. Vivienne stared at him. 22 years of silence. 22 years of believing that after her mother died, no one had come looking for her. 22 years of foster homes, shelters, park benches, and the slow, grinding erosion of believing she had been forgotten. And this man was telling her she had not been forgotten at all. There's more, Arthur said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unlock it. Your mother set up a trust before the accident. She was meticulous about protecting you. The trust was placed under my custodianship until you could be located. It has been sitting untouched for 22 years. Vivienne shook her head slowly. That's not possible. It is, Arthur said. The trust has grown substantially. Your mother wanted you to be safe. She wanted you to have choices. She wanted you to have the life she was building for you before it was taken away. Dominic's hand tightened on Vivienne's shoulder. She was trembling beneath his fingers. How much? Dominic asked quietly. Arthur looked at him, then at Vivienne. Enough, he said, that she will never have to sit on a bench in the rain again. Vivienne pressed both hands against her mouth. The tears came then, not loud, not dramatic, but with the deep shuddering silence of someone who had held herself together for so long that falling apart felt like a language she had forgotten how to speak. Dominic pulled her gently against his side. She buried her face in his shoulder, and he held her there, steady and warm, while the ballroom watched in stunned silence. Victoria stood near the dance floor, champagne in hand, watching the scene unfold. She did not understand what was happening, but she understood what she was losing: the room's attention, the evening's narrative, the certainty that she was the most important woman in this building. Arthur turned to Dominic. She should not go back to wherever she has been staying. Not tonight, not ever. Dominic looked down at Vivienne, whose face was still pressed against his shoulder. She won't. An hour later, Dominic stepped into the hotel lobby and made a phone call. He did not explain himself to anyone. He simply called Miriam Castillo, the owner of a private atelier on Michigan Avenue, who had dressed half the women on Forbes's most powerful list, and owed Dominic a favor from a real estate deal he had structured for her 3 years earlier. I need a gown, he said, tonight. Dominic, it's 9 o'clock on a Saturday. I know what time it is. Floor length. Deep burgundy. Something that makes people stop talking. Miriam paused. How soon? 45 minutes. That's insane. I'll wire you whatever it costs before you hang up. 40 minutes later, a black sedan pulled up to the hotel's service entrance. Inside was a garment bag, a pair of heeled sandals in soft gold leather, and a small velvet box containing a pair of pearl drop earrings. Dominic brought everything to the suite where Vivienne was waiting. She had showered. The hotel had provided everything she needed, and her auburn hair fell in clean, damp waves past her shoulders. She stood in a hotel robe, barefoot on the marble floor, looking more vulnerable and more beautiful than anyone Dominic had ever seen. He hummed the garment bag on the bathroom door. You don't have to wear it if you don't want to. She unzipped the bag and went still. The gown was deep burgundy silk, floor length, with a fitted bodice and a skirt that flowed like dark wine being poured. It was not covered in crystals or diamonds. It did not need to be. It was the kind of dress that made everything else in the room look like it was trying too hard. Vivienne ran her fingers along the fabric. "This is for me." "It was always for you," Dominic said. The room just didn't know it yet. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the dress into the bathroom and closed the door. When she emerged, Dominic forgot how to breathe. The burgundy silk followed the lines of her body as though it had been made for her. The color deepened her auburn hair and made her hazel eyes glow amber. The pearl earrings caught the light softly, and the crescent birthmark below her left ear, the one that had led Arthur Langford back to a memory 22 years old, was visible and unashamed. She was not the woman from the bench anymore, but she was also not someone new. She was the woman she had always been, finally visible. "How do I look?" she asked. Dominic's voice was rough. "Like the woman your mother raised you to be." Vivienne's eyes filled, but she did not cry. She had cried enough for one night. Instead, she lifted her chin, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the ballroom doors. When the doors opened, the room went silent. Not the gradual, spreading silence of earlier, when people had whispered and stared. This was immediate, total, the kind of silence that happens when something appears that no one was prepared for. Vivienne walked through the ballroom in the burgundy gown with her hair falling in soft waves and her head held high. She did not rush. She did not look down. She walked as though she had been walking into rooms like this her entire life and had simply taken a brief detour. Dominic met her halfway across the floor. He extended his hand. She took it. At the head table, Victoria set down her champagne glass very slowly. Reese leaned toward her. "Vic, are you okay?" Victoria did not answer. She was watching Dominic look at Vivienne the way he had never once looked at her. Not with possession, not with possession, not with pride, with reverence. Arthur Langford stood from his table. The room was still quiet, and when he picked up a microphone, the silence deepened. "I was not planning to speak tonight," he began. His voice was steady now, carrying the weight of a man who had spent decades choosing his words carefully from a bench of law. "But something has happened this evening that I cannot let pass without acknowledgement." He turned toward Vivienne. 22 years ago, a woman named Isabelle Moreau dedicated her life to defending people who had no one to speak for them. She was a brilliant attorney, a devoted mother, and one of the finest human beings I have ever had the honor of knowing. She died in an accident when her daughter was 12 years old. That daughter disappeared into a system that failed her in every conceivable way. His voice tightened. "Tonight, I found her, standing in this room, wearing borrowed clothes, soaked from the rain, while people in designer gowns laughed behind their champagne glasses. The room was absolutely still. Some of you looked at her tonight and saw someone beneath you, someone to pity, someone to mock." Arthur's eyes moved across the crowd. "I looked at her and saw the daughter of a woman who had more courage, more integrity, and more grace than this entire room combined." Vivienne's hand tightened around Dominic's. Arthur lifted his glass to Vivienne Moreau, not because of the trust her mother left her, not because her name carries weight, but because she walked into a room that tried to break her, and she refused to bend. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Dominic began to clap, slowly, deliberately. One by one, the guests stood. The applause built until it filled the ballroom, bouncing off the chandeliers and the marble floors and the tall windows that looked out over the city lights. Some clapped because they were moved, some because they were ashamed, and some because they finally understood that the most powerful person in the room had never been the bride. Vivienne turned to Dominic. Tears were running down her face, but she was smiling. "Why did you do all of this?" she whispered. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't know about my mother or the trust or any of it." Dominic looked at her, and his face held nothing performative. No calculation. No agenda. Just a man who had walked into a building expecting to feel nothing and had instead felt everything. "Because you were sitting in the rain with your back straight," he said. "And I thought anyone who could hold on to their dignity after everything the world had done to them was someone worth knowing." She looked at him through her tears, and then she kissed him. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was not staged for the audience. It was soft and slow and full of the kind of tenderness that only exists between two people who have both known what it means to be abandoned and have decided, quietly, to stop being alone. Victoria watched from across the room. The champagne in her hand had gone flat. The diamonds on her dress caught the light, but they no longer sparkled the way they had at the beginning of the evening. She looked at Rice, who was scrolling through his phone, already bored by his own reception. She looked at Dominic, who was holding Vivienne's face in both hands, as though she were the most important thing he had ever touched. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Clement understood exactly what she had thrown away. The rest of the evening belonged to Dominic and Vivienne. He kept her hand in his. He introduced her to every person who approached, not as a curiosity or a charity case, but as the woman he intended to know for a very long time. When someone tried to ask prying questions about her past, Dominic redirected the conversation with the ease of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. When Vivienne looked overwhelmed, he bent close and whispered something that made her laugh. When the orchestra played a slow song, he led her to the floor. "I don't know how to dance," she said. "Neither do I," he lied. "We'll figure it out." They moved slowly under the chandeliers, and Vivienne rested her hand on his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and real, against her palm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not walking past me." Dominic pulled her closer. "Thank you for not walking away." That night, Dominic took Vivienne to his home on Lake Shore Drive. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows in the burgundy gown and looked out at the city she had been sleeping in for the past 3 years. From up here, Chicago looked gentle. The lights reflected off the lake like scattered coins, and the streets that had been so cold and indifferent at ground level seemed almost beautiful from 32 floors above. "Tell me about her," Dominic said, handing her a cup of tea. "Your mother." Vivienne held the cup with both hands. "She used to read me case files as bedtime stories. Not the details, just the outcomes. She'd say, 'Today I helped a family stay together,' or 'Today I made sure a little girl could go to school.' She wanted me to know that one person could change things." "She was right," Dominic said. "She died thinking the world would take care of me," Vivienne said. "It didn't." Dominic sat beside her. "It's starting to." She looked at him, and something that had been locked inside her for 22 years began, very slowly, to open. They talked until the sky turned pale gray over the lake. Dominic told her about the collapse of Meridian, the betrayal of Victoria and Reese, and the months he spent rebuilding everything from nothing. Vivienne told him about the foster homes, 8 of them in 6 years, and the shelters after she aged out of the system, and the long, grinding loneliness of being a person the world had decided not to see. Before sunrise, she fell asleep on his shoulder. Dominic sat perfectly still, watching the light change over the water, holding her carefully, as though she were something the universe had finally returned after keeping it hidden for far too long. 6 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning in the garden of the Lake Shore Drive penthouse, Dominic knelt in front of Vivienne with a ring that had belonged to his mother. "I am not a perfect man," he said, "but I will spend every day making sure you never sit in the rain alone again." Vivienne pulled him to his feet and kissed him. "I was never waiting to be saved," she said. "I was waiting to be seen." They married in a small ceremony by the lake. No society columns, no 300-person guest list, no chandeliers or crystal centerpieces, just Vivienne in a simple white dress, Dominic in a navy suit, Arthur Langford reading a poem Isabelle Moreau had written for her daughter when Vivienne was 3 years old. A poem Arthur had kept in his desk drawer for 22 years, waiting for the day he could deliver it. Victoria and Rhys divorced 11 months after their wedding. The society columns covered it the way they covered weather. Dominic and Vivienne built a life that was neither loud nor showy. They filled their home with books and laughter and, eventually, 2 children. A boy with Dominic's dark eyes and a girl with Vivienne's auburn hair and the same crescent birthmark below her left ear. Some nights, after the children were asleep, Vivienne would stand at the window and look out at the city. Dominic would come up behind her and rest his chin on her shoulder, and they would stand there together in the quiet. "Do you ever think about that night?" she once asked. "Every day," he said. "What if you had walked past me?" Dominic kissed the birthmark below her ear. "I couldn't have. Some people you walk past. Some people you walk toward. I knew the difference the moment I saw you." Vivienne leaned back against him and closed her eyes. Outside, the city stretched on in every direction. Cold and warm, cruel and kind, full of people walking past each other without seeing. But in this window, in this light, 2 people who had both been abandoned by the world stood together and proved that the right love does not rescue you from who you are. It simply refuses to let you be invisible. And once it sees you, it never looks away.